We are here today with Susan McPherson. And Susan, it's an honor to have you on. Thank you for taking some time to be with us.
I am thrilled. Thank you.
Yeah, so we want to start at the beginning. I want to learn, tell me from the start, what was your early childhood like, your family dynamic, where you're from? Let's get to know you a little bit from the start.
Well, I often say, and I certainly don't want to disparage any location, but I often say I'm from the dullest place on the planet. In upstate New York, outside of Albany, which I will caveat that with saying it's a safe and wonderful place to raise a family. I was the youngest of three. My parents were both public servants. My father was a professor for close to 40 years at a women's college, and my mother worked for public television in public information for much of my probably from my 10 to my age 20. And we were an anomaly. We were probably the only Jewish family within, 15 square miles. So I grew up very much being an other, and always feeling like I was an oddball because we ate different foods and I didn't have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches when everybody else did. And I wasn't allowed to go to ballroom dancing classes with my friends in 7th and 8th grade on Friday nights because the country clubs didn't allow Jews. So it's very, odd. And I guess, things that, today, would definitely not exist. But also I had parents that were children of the Depression. All my grandparents came over from what was then Soviet Union in the early 20th century. And so my parents grew up being very frugal, spend within your means. But I think one of the gifts they gave me, well, several gifts they gave me, but one in particular was this notion of it's more about the places you see than the things you have, than the material things. My mom used to always say if something bad happened, at least no one was hurt.
Mm-hmm.
If a
it's a very Jewish mother thing to say, exactly. Right? I've heard that my whole life. And it's funny to hear that, it's culturally, that's something, maybe we can relate to that's unique but it's interesting, really. I mean, it does say a lot.
Well, I'm 56 now. And when I look back at my life, I don't remember the things. I remember the trips. I remember the travels. I remember the experiences. And tragically, she was killed when I was 22 and she was 56, which is the age I am now, in a god-awful hotel fire that killed 97 other people. So that what she used to say to me as a teen obviously became so much more apparent, right? When actually somebody actually was just ripped from the earth. And this was in 1986, so long before 9/11, but had very similar overtones. The fire was set by a disgruntled employee who basically torched the hotel.
Susan, I want to come back and talk to you about that. But something you said kind of early on, sorry to interrupt you, kind of caught my attention. And you shared your age, so it gives some context. But I think people don't really appreciate that not being allowed to go to a country club, not being able to join, being because you were Jewish is really recent history. I think oftentimes people feel like that's just much further in the past than it actually is. And I'm wondering, maybe if you could elaborate a little bit on really what that was like for your family. You kind of indicated maybe you were feeling like you were odd or something, was different. Tell me, as a kid, at that time in your life, what did that do to you? What did that do for you? How did that make you feel and change kind of your experience that you had?
I wish I had the magic answer for that. I think it made me crave normalcy. To go overboard, to surround myself with people that perhaps weren't, quote unquote, what I considered weird. in fifth grade, I still remember a young woman named Cindy David, and I have no idea whatever happened to her. So hopefully she's not listening to this podcast. But she said to me, you're going to go to hell because you killed Christ. Mm. And, being a 10-year-old on the playground, of course, I came home crying hysterically, and I had no idea what that even meant. But it's hard at this point to recall exactly what then transpired.
Sure.
And, I think my parents just, for them, they picked upstate New York for a variety of reasons. My dad got a teaching position there, and the schools, the New York State public schools at the time were very, very good, and education was number one. So I think for them, it was just continue to persevere and relish in your differences. But that's really hard to tell a 10-year-old, right?
Sure.
And I'm sure, later in life, the decisions I made, whether it be the man that I married, we are now divorced, but, things like that I think possibly were rooted in this kind of desire to be just like everyone else.
I that's kind of what I was curious about, and you're right. As a 10-year-old, we don't really know how to make sense of any of this, right? It's kind of in hindsight, that like, as you said, there was a craving for normalcy. And then like, how does that play out as you pick partners or pick jobs? I've talked pretty openly in my life about kind of, my programming and certain kind of societal expectations that I think men had, or in my family, were valued, and how that led me in my career and how that led me down the path that I went down. And so I do find, like, oftentimes these events, somebody saying something like that to you, it gets to be a bit of like an embodied experience that you maybe unconsciously live into until you later on maybe can recognize that.
But I have to state, my experiences were nothing like people of color have experienced in this country for hundreds of years. And I don't want to go so far as say, oh, woe is me. I still was able to go to school. I was able to get a good education. I was able to get jobs. I wasn't discriminated against. So, I do think it's important, but I think it's important also to realize, like you said, this is not that far a bit long ago, right?
Yeah.
I think we forget also that the Holocaust wasn't that long ago, and there's a revisionist history that is saying it never happened.
Yeah. And you're right about all of that. I think, it's important to kind of draw attention. The point about the Holocaust is why I, was really struck by, your comments opening. And you're right. Still, relatively speaking, we were able to do a lot as Jews that others were not. And still, that's probably the case. You started to talk a little bit about kind of your mother and that story. Yeah. And, I read that in your bio and just, kind of immediately, had so much sadness and compassion for you. And I'm interested to kind of hear, I'm sure it's been something that's been super influential in your life in many ways. And yet, I guess maybe at the beginning, maybe you could kind of go back and tell a little bit more about, what happened and how that impacted you, at that time in your life.
Sure. Well, I will honestly say probably the first 10 years I was in a coma. A moving coma, a functioning coma. But, when you suffer from that kind of loss that is so sudden that you can't plan for it, you really, we don't have the tools to be able to process it. I, of course, even at the immediate, I think, instinct for me was to run away. And, at the time, my dad was still very influential in my life, of course, because I was still fairly young. And, he insisted I stay in graduate school and not, take time off to leave, because he wanted to instill some sense of normalcy. And this was also back in the day when there was not, platforms in the internet and ways to find support for grief. You were literally handed, 7 books that existed on, the bookshelf on how to deal with death. And again, growing up in a very Christian society, it was very much about okay, you honor them when they die and then you move on and you never speak to them again. And one tenet of Judaism, or at least the Judaism that I was brought up in, is that even if people die, you continue to talk about them and you raise their memory all the time. So I think the hardest thing in my 20s probably was this notion that so many people ran away from me because they didn't know how to actually, they didn't know what to say. It was like they felt like if they brought my mom up, it would bring me down. And what they didn't understand was she was never not on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And, I do want to just fast forward for a second, because about 5 or 6 years ago, dear friends of mine today, or, 5 or 6 years ago, founded a platform called Modern Loss, which for anyone who goes through any kind of loss and is grieving, whether it be the loss of a pet, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a parent, you name it. It's a platform that provides all sorts of writings and connections to people so that you aren't alone. Okay. So I do think in my 20s, there was very much of a, I want to flee. And I ended up fleeing. About 5 years later, I moved from Washington, D.C. to Southern California, where I knew no one, for a new job. And it was really, I think, my quest, again, in hindsight, to start over, start afresh, forget about what happened, which, haha, good luck. But, over my lifetime, if I was to say one of the positives that came of dealing with such a tragedy, is that you've already suffered the worst. So it enables you to take risks that perhaps you would be less likely to take. Because if the worst has already happened, what else could happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Really interesting perspective. That last piece I find to be pretty compelling. Let me just understand a little bit, though, because you were in your early 20s, and I totally get it. Makes sense, this coma, and also the idea that people were going away from you.
Yeah.
I understand that even still today is probably a reaction that some people have. The triggers or the uncomfortable kind of space of being in that emotion with somebody is really something that people maybe by and large are just not comfortable doing. And
until they suffer loss,
until they experience something like that. Yeah.
Well, this will give you an inkling of the type of my mom's personality. When I was 13, my best girlfriend's mother died of cancer. And I still to this day remember my mom saying to me after she passed, "Whatever you do, Susan, don't ever be afraid to bring up her name after the fact." Mm-hmm. And Linda and I, to this day, we still talk about her mother. And at my mom's memorial service, I raised that. And I stated exactly what she had told me. And I asked the 600 people that turned up during a northeaster snowstorm to honor my mom, I said, let's never be afraid to speak her name. And honestly, that is why this book is in a way so deeply special to me, because I wrote it in honor of her, because she was known as a serial connector. Long before the internet, long before social media, using the old-fashioned telephone and a manual typewriter. Mm-hmm. So when I think now that I can, in some teeny way, keep her memory alive, to me, even if the book sells 10 copies, I hope it sells a few more than that. But me, at least, I have done, a real honor and tribute to her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's really kind of the point of the podcast, is really to see how these life experiences really can allow you to create from a place that you can use the experience to either be beneficial in your journey and hopefully in the journey of others. And it's not to kind of replace the loss and the trauma and the and all that is there with something as tragic as the experience that you went through. But you do at a certain point make the decision that you want to live and that there's some value in this experience you've had. You
Yeah.
talked a little bit about kind of the risk piece. Tell me a little bit more about, okay, what did you do then with that kind of next step? I'm curious, to kind of learn a little bit more about from that time in your life, up to the book, a lot happens, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah, talk a little bit about like what you do next and kind of how you really start to get into your career and your life.
Well, I often start conversations saying I've had 9 lives, on that. It has been a very I can never say the word, circuitous, you know the word I'm trying to say, circuitous journey. And part of the theme of the book is this notion that it is the detours, not the destination. And I have had multiple detours and multiple losses. But I did end up in Southern California. I had been working for USA Today in Washington, and they transferred me to Southern California, which made me laugh because it felt like living in 501c. What was the name of that? Baywatch. Like every day seemed like Baywatch, which growing up on the East Coast and living in DC was almost hysterical because people would leave work at 4 o'clock to go golfing. And, when you live in New York City or Washington, D.C. or Boston, that's just not the case. And I used to joke that they didn't need weathermen because every day was 75 and sunny. But it was, I think, in some ways therapeutic for me to have that opportunity to start over. But as far as I could run, the demon was still there, the hurt, the pain, the sorrow. And I ended up leaving the job that I was working at, which was USA Today, because I won't bore you with all the details, but I ended up joining a company called PR Newswire, which is a company I would be with over 17 years. But it ended up that I became that person that was running special projects, meaning every 2 years I would be put on a different project, which actually for someone who has somewhat of ADD, it was great because I was able to do something, kick it out of the park, and then go on to the next thing. And I think what I found was as the busier I made myself, the less I had to deal with the pain. And while I was working there, I started to get very involved in nonprofits and supporting nonprofits as my way to give back. And probably subliminally to honor, again, my mom's life working for public television. As a child, I would say to her, Mom, why aren't you working for, PBS? I'm sorry, why aren't you working for ABC or CBS or any of the real TV stations? Because you make a lot more money. And she would say, because the content is terrible. So, there was this sense of, okay, I, need to be doing good in this world. And quite frankly, I found that joining nonprofits wherever I would be moving would be a great way to meet people who had similar values. So that became very much also of who I was.
And I'm curious, I appreciate you saying that in some ways keeping busy really kind of helped you not have to deal with the pain. When you think about that, do you think that was really helpful to have you move through that time, or did you eventually still need to deal with the pain?
Oh yeah, I'm still dealing with the pain.
And how did you do that? How do you eventually choose to deal with the pain?
I never did.
Okay.
And I'm sure it comes out in all kinds of weird fits and this and that. But also, humans are pretty resilient. And I think, building a company at the age of 48 took a lot. So, and then serving on multiple boards. I mean, as you can see, I keep myself very busy. But I don't know the specific answer. I mean, obviously, I went through years of therapy. But, it's not like, the easiest thing would be just to bring her back.
Yeah. Well, and when you say you never did, it sounds like you did do a lot of work around this. I mean, if you're in years in therapy and, it's just what I don't know if this is what you meant, but it sounds to me like it's a pain that you just can't make go away. It
No.
is what it is, right? It's just not something you can heal from entirely. It becomes part
No.
of who you are.
I will tell you, in 1987, 6 months after she was killed, and I still to this day remember reading this New York Times op-ed by Anna Quinlan, the writer, who basically in the article was talking about how she lost her mom. And she said that when she was 20, 21, 22, and she would walk into a party and she would introduce herself. She didn't say this, but she wanted to say, "Hi, I'm Anna Quinlan, and I lost my mother to cancer when I was 18."
Mhm.
It was such a defining factor of who she was. And the fact that now, 34 years later, I still remember, I can see the article.
Mhm.
And over the years, occasionally I've Googled, I mean, you can still find it online. But I think that defines anyone who goes through tragedy, whether you're 10 or 20 or what have you.
Mhm.
And the co-writer of my book, Jackie Ashton, she lost her mother at age 9.
Mhm.
And I mean, so we had an immediate bonding. But I do think one of the ways I have dealt with over all these years is my commitment to service and my commitment to giving back. I mean, I have funded now 18 women-led startups, angel invested. I'm not an heiress. I don't, I don't have millions and millions of dollars, but I did that to help these women realize their dreams and be able to create jobs and livelihoods. I have to believe that comes from somehow trying to fill a gap in me.
Mhm.
I mean, why else?
Mhm.
I mean, if I was to really deeply unravel.
Well, I think it all makes a lot of sense in that, when something really tragic happens, there's a trauma of some kind that we end up kind of living the way we live as a result of it. And that can go a number of ways, right? I mean, that can go down some paths that are really dark and really destructive. And it can also go into things like creation
Yeah.
and service, right? And in your case, sounds like what you did is you poured yourself into your work, into building businesses, and to engaging in service, both through wanting to do well for people, do good for people, but also to connect with people, which ends up becoming like a really, really big part of your life.
Yeah.
And so, I kind of have a belief when I just, kind of think about it, and it's the way I think about things, is that, you're never really off the path, that even if maybe you're soothing with busyness, right, or by serving other people, it's a part of exactly where you are and what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And let's talk about that then, because you end up creating some really amazing stuff and doing some incredible work. Elaborate a little bit on kind of that piece.
Specifically, you mean the work, my company's work?
Yeah, the company you create, and a little bit more about the service work and the angel investing. I mean, I think this is you kind of just said I've invested in 18 women, but this is a big deal. This is really great. Like, we need to highlight that.
I know. But isn't that funny? Like, I am just like, well, of course I did. Of course, like, couldn't everybody? No, I'm my hardest critic. But no, I founded my company at the age of 48 when I had no intention of being an entrepreneur. In fact, I still am terrible at Excel files or Excel, which I think if you run a business, you really should know how to do Excel. But
not necessarily.
And it really it was a lark, because the consultancy I was with previously, there was a exodus of talent. And in the consulting world, when the talent leaves, guess what? You need to start figuring out what you're going to do. Mm-hmm. So I was starting to get nervous. I was living at the time with my boyfriend, who was not earning any financial return. And so the heavy load was on my shoulders to kind of maintain the household. And I knew I either needed to find a new job fast, or I needed to at least have some interim opportunity. And two organizations said, Susan, if you decide to go out on your own, we'll hire you for a couple of months each. So I left on a Friday. I hung the shingle on a Monday. I never took any time off because I thought they both were going to change their mind. And I never would have named it McPherson Strategies if I thought it was going to become anything, because it was my ex-husband from years ago, from 2003. Now, I mind you, he's a great guy. We had an amicable breakup. We're still friends today. But to me, it was the most narcissistic thing in the world to name a company after you. I mean, I get it. People do it all the time. It does not fit my character or the essence of me. So anyhow, now 8 years later, we're thriving. We just hired our 12th employee. The world now is really making purpose, compassion, empathy, social impact, sustainability number one. So in some ways, we were a little bit ahead of the game. But again, this was never part of the plan. And I also continued my craziness of getting on nonprofit boards. Probably the one that has had the greatest impact on me, at least from a awareness and learning perspective, is the U.S. arm of the UN High Commission for Refugees. So every year for the last 6 years, prior to 2020, I would visit refugee hotspots in the world, from Kenya and Uganda to the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, to the border of Venezuela, where you have thousands and thousands of Venezuelans fleeing. And I did that at my own cost to go, but because if I'm going to be advocating or raising money for this cause, I felt I really needed to understand. And I have to say, no one on this planet is more resilient than somebody who's fleeing their homes with nothing. So anyhow, I don't mean to take us down a different path, but...
Well, no, I think it's a good one, because you kind of started off talking about this a little bit too, that, your belief around, experiences and, what you see and where you go and the value you have around that. I also value that experience driven life quite a bit. I believe that, I've taken my kids and family around the world, and it wasn't, ever to kind of, get to fancy places and restaurants. It was always about the experience. Yeah. It didn't matter where we were. I just was so happy to be together, experiencing something. And, your experiences are not ones that are kind of for the faint of heart. You're actually getting into some places where you're seeing some things that are pretty eye-opening and pretty impactful. And that's got to shape you. That's got to really change your worldview and your perspective on life.
And make you, talk about making you a more compassionate human being to understand true human struggle, correct? Mm-hmm. But also by going on those trips, I wasn't having to travel alone too. For years, the thought of, I would travel on business, quote unquote, alone all the time. But the thought of going on a holiday alone was a bit unnerving. And when my ex-boyfriend, not the ex-husband, and I broke up in 2014, it's interesting because the S curve of my company went like this. It went right up, because all of a sudden I could just focus on the business. But all of a sudden it dawned on me, I'm not getting any younger. I should start taking real vacations alone. And what's interesting is the last trip I took before the pandemic was to Antarctica. And somebody, this is just a funny side note. Somebody said to me before I was going, "Is this your first trip to Antarctica?" And I remember laughing, thinking, who goes to Antarctica twice, right? Unless you're a scientist. And the day I got back, I couldn't wait at the thought of returning.
Wow. That's great.
I was just asked the other day where would be the first place I would go when this all ends. And I said, Antarctica.
And why? I've never been. Tell me, what is it about it that it's so special?
because you feel like you're on another planet, because you
Yeah.
kind of are.
Yeah.
I mean, the entire time, the only humans you see, of course, are on the boat that you're on.
Yeah.
But the colors, the light, the water. I mean, it is extraordinary. And I've never been somewhere, and I've been to some pretty remote places like Afghanistan and Laos and Sri Lanka. You don't hear anything, which is kind of odd.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But
and probably nice.
Comforting. Yeah.
Yeah, probably really nice, especially as you sit in Brooklyn.
Although it's been remarkably quiet.
It's pretty quiet for Brooklyn. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the book. I want to really understand kind of how the book came to be, for starters. Oftentimes, and I just interviewed somebody else who's releasing a book, and I've thought about it myself, and I think sometimes I hear a lot of that, and sometimes, and I haven't done it. A lot of people feel like it's just like something that's coming out of them that has to be done, but not in your case. Tell me about the book. Why the book?
Well, and I hate to keep bringing up my mom, but if anything that I inherited from her was this thirst to connect people. I get so much joy. It's probably like some neuroses, but I absolutely love introducing people and then watching the magic that happens. And it's not just the immediate action, but it is what happens over the test of time. And I will say I am blessed with a really remarkable memory. And again, I say these things now that probably I never would have been able to say in my 30s or 40s. But my older brother has a remarkable memory for numbers. So he can remember, the exact time and date of somebody's death or birth, but actually just like the actual minute. I remember people and their descriptors, like, what is their children's favorite food? I mean, really stupid, wasteful stuff that doesn't matter. But when you're introducing people, can be really helpful. Because I find if you introduce people and you bring some sense of commonality, whether it's, they have 10 years ago visited the same city and went to the same restaurant, to, both of them having loved the same favorite book. I mean, I love to be able to do that so that then when they carry on, they're super comfortable with one another. So having done this since, probably my high school years, about 5 years ago, folks started saying to me, you really should write a book about your methodology. And I'm like, but I don't have a methodology. I just do it. And then more and more people kept coming to say that to me. And I have probably over the last 6 years held nothing short of 50 to 75 gatherings on my roof deck, celebrating everything from new babies to weddings to politicians running for office to raising money for causes, where I would literally just go about and introduce people. And I remember reading about Lois Weisberg that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about in the New Yorker years ago. And I'm not certainly comparing myself to her, but she was the connector in Chicago, where she was able to bring together people from all different walks of life and make the magic happen. So reading that, I was like, well, I'm kind of like a mini her. And maybe it could help people if I shared kind of how I go about doing it. So that was the impetus for the book. And the book is broken down into 3 parts. It is a business book. So I was told I had to be very prescriptive. And again, you're talking to the girl that doesn't like Excel. So prescriptive is sometimes hard for me. But it is broken down into 3 parts: gather, ask, do. And I'm happy to go through those parts if you're interested.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I saw that and I'm very intrigued by that. And why don't we do that first? I want to kind of go back and talk to you a little bit about why not to do the book and the experience of writing the book. And even the fact that somebody told you, it has to be prescriptive, So let's talk about where you landed though, because I love it. Gather, ask, do.
Sure. Well, first of all, it is going to be, when you go to the bookstore, it will be in the networking genre. And I make the case that this is not about networking. There is a need, and networking has existed, but the way I look at networking is it's very transactional. It's walking into a room and meeting as many people as you can and getting business cards. And then, 6 months from now, when you need something, you go to that card and you write that person and say, hey, I'm looking for a job, or hey, can you introduce me to? That is not what this is about. The three components: gather is first looking inside yourself and really doing an honest kind of audit or assessment of what is the community you want to build around you? Who do you want to have in your life more than just a hi and bye? Okay, so it's not about a numbers game. It can be 3 people, it can be 300 people, but it's really looking first at yourself. And part of that also took me into this area of FOMO, because a lot of people will say, well, how do I gather if, I don't get invited to places? So my contention is, be the gatherer. Don't wait to be invited. That way, instead of fear of missing out, you actually create joy of meeting others, which I termed very kind of goofy, but JOMO. And when you hear JOMO, you think of joy of missing out. And I say, no, it's the joy of meeting others. Because at least in my life and many people that I know, it's actually amazing meeting people, because you learn so much.
Yeah.
About yourself, about them, about the world, that you would not had you learn things you would never know if you didn't meet that person.
Yeah. Which is really only true if you are of that mindset.
Well,
right. Because I think a lot of people think about kind of networking events or even gatherings as like I have to go do this thing. And, there's going to be all these people there and all this small talk. And, you can kind of go into like, it's not for me. But if you're going into it with a joy for meeting other people open to what's possible, it's really, amazing.
Well, I think also if you walk into that room, not with believe me, I'm the first person to want to hide in the bathroom. I know I seem like I'm an extrovert. There are moments where I am just like, oh my God, I don't belong here. I'm like nothing. I don't matter. But the thing is, if you look around and you say maybe 2 people, you don't have to meet everyone. You can have conversations with 2 people. Yeah. And there are portions of the book that address, if you're an introvert, how do you do this? Good. And you actually, you find the connector in the room and you hang with that connector who then can help you. It's a little like your wingman or wingwoman.
All right. Good. All right. Ask. Tell us about ask.
Well, ask is exactly what you were just, leads to what you were saying is, first of all, there's a chapter that's dedicated to what are the questions you can ask to elicit responses. And I will tell you, when I am 5 foot tall with heels. Okay, my license says I'm 5 foot, so technically I'm 5 foot. But over the years, when I would walk into the proverbial conference room, boardroom, convention hall, dinner party, no one would see me. Yes, we all look over others to see who else is in the room. I don't, because I can't see, but most people, it's just it's human nature, right? We're curious. But I found to actually get people to engage, if you ask them questions about themselves, generally, and again, this is a generalization, but generally, they will respond. And if you ask questions that aren't about, gee, what's the weather like in your city today if you're on a virtual call? Or what did you have for lunch? But instead, ask questions like, how have you been faring during this pandemic? And what do you need help with? Chances are, unless they're an ogre, that person is going to respond to you. So to me, it's really finessing. And I think of this as anything else, whether it's riding a bike or, hopscotching, you get better with practice. But I do believe if you have these types of meaningful conversations and ask those kind of questions, it will elicit the responses that then enable you to go to the do. And the do, I don't want to say one of each of the 3 is more important, but the do is creating trust and reliability and following through. People often say to me, Susan, on your epitaph, it's going to say she got shit done. You know what? If that's what it says, so be it. I guess there's a whole lot worse things it could say. But I pride myself on when somebody says, "Can you do this?" I usually get it done. And also, if I can't get it done, I fess up and I either say I can't get it done or I find somebody who might be able to help them. So that is the kind of circle. But if you don't ask the proper questions, you won't know what is important to that person. Therefore, guess what? You can't be helpful.
That's wonderful. I love it. It's we have a kind of an internal joke because I once said in a meeting with a big group of architects and bankers and all these people that were trying to kind of figure out how to make this project we were working on happen. And I said, listen, our superpower is that we get shit done. And they thought that was the craziest. I'm like, no, I mean it. We don't sit in rooms and talk about stuff and then don't do it. If we're going to talk about it, we're going to get it done. And I think it's really an important thing. But I love the part before. Ask, right? Because what you're saying is don't come in there and start telling people what you have to offer or what you want to sell them, right? Yeah. People hear enough of that. They might really actually want to hear all of that. But what they really want is, how can I help? What do you need? How can I support you? Give you some assistance. And then whether you can do it or not. And if you can and you want to, you will. Yeah.
I mean, I'll be honest with you. About 2 years ago, I looked back at the financial records of our company, which of course I have trouble reading. And I learned that 98% of our business was inbound. And it dawned on me that isn't the norm, right? I mean, consulting firms have to do marketing, et cetera. I mean, yes, granted, I gave talks, I did speeches, I wrote articles, but 98% is a pretty significant number. And it dawned on me that all those years of meeting with people, being inquisitive, doing the ask, and then doing the do has come back in spades. And it's not like when I was 25 and I met with somebody, Brenda South, for instance, who was a client of mine when I worked at PR Newswire, and she was working for Western Digital. I still remember this. It is not like I said to her, if I do this for you in 30 years, I'm going to come back and you're going to hire my firm. Right? That's not what it's about. It's this, right. And that is, I think, the real difference between what I think this book is all about and traditional networking.
Great. And sometimes I think it's really surprising in the way that things do come back around, right? When you're not actually focused on an outcome, something even greater can happen. Tell me, just because I think that this is interesting, we have people that are in this space that listen to the podcast. There's a lot of dialogue, like I said, about platforms and writing books. Tell me, are you just at the point where this book is about to launch and it's just been tough and fatiguing and hard? Or what? Tell me, really, what should people know about writing a book?
Sure. Well, hopefully they have. I just honestly, and it's maybe my insecurities, I never felt I had anything that anybody would be interested in. So getting over that hump has been a fleeting, throughout the whole process. I kept, as I was working on it, I kept thinking, well, nobody cares. So that's my own internal demon. So I certainly don't want to put anyone on that thought, but I do want to make sure people realize it's a huge effort. And you need a village. The days are gone where you would get a massive advance and, you'd be able to take time off from your day job. Again, there are fabulous authors and writers out there that this is their job and they do wonderfully at it. And I would never say, but I think for those of us who have day jobs, it's a big slog. And I don't think, and this is nothing negative against my publisher or any other publishers, gone are the day where they do a lot to support you. So you do really need that village. And, I don't have kids. I don't have a partner or spouse. I don't have parents. So obviously I have a lot more time. But even then, it took an enormous effort and enormous time. Yeah. And, I certainly am not going into this with any expectations of making any money. But I do think it does Well, I'm just going to peel back the layers. It's a love letter to my mom. And it's a
Yeah.
wonderful way to keep her memory alive to people that, in the next 5 years would never, ever, ever had heard of her.
And I think that is really reason enough. And kind of in a similar fashion to, how you are structuring the Gather, Ask, Do. I see it as you're showing up and there's a need for something that you can provide to other people and you're doing it and we'll see what happens. But it seems to be a really relevant and important and right step to take. And again, I think, I've thought about this myself. And if you're only doing it as a love letter, that's enough. That's enough. But I think it's going to really be impactful, especially coming out of COVID. I mean, the art of connecting, the lost art of connecting. I think it's wonderful. So,
well, I will tell you briefly. The fact that we now have a glimmer of hope, with the vaccines coming, with government that is pushing to get more people vaccinated, we can now actually look forward to the day when we are together again. So my thought is, if folks read this book, we have a chance to reset, to maybe continue to use the technology that enables us to do this, thankfully, which separates us from 1918, but also take advantage of the humanity of it all when we can be together again, and never, ever, ever take advantage or not value how important our human connections are.
Yeah, I think you're right. People, I think, have a better sense of just how important it is to be in connection with people after what we've been through over the past year. So I'm excited to have you launch this book, March 23rd, The Lost Art of Connecting. Susan, any final thoughts to share with the audience? Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me.
Well, I want to thank your audience for listening to this crazy woman. And I want to open my roof deck to all of them when they can travel again and they can come to Brooklyn. I love, love, love meeting new people. And this was a joy. I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you so very much.
Wonderful. Yes, same. And we'll make sure people can find you. And again, buy the book, March 23rd, The Lost Art of Connecting. Susan McPherson, thank you so much for your time and being with us.